Originally, the name Rus referred to the people, regions, and medieval states of the Kievan Rus. In the Western culture, it is better known as Ruthenia from the 11th century onwards. Its territories are today distributed among Belarus, Ukraine, and a part of the European section of Russia. One of the earliest written sources mentioning the people called Rus dates back to year 839 in a Carolingian chronicle from Francia, the Annales Bertiniani. The Carolingians identified them as a Germanic tribe called the Swedes. According to the Kievan Rus primary chronicle, compiled in about 1113, the Rus were a group of Varangians, Norsemen who had relocated somewhere from the Baltic region, first to northeastern Europe, then to the south where they created the medieval Kievan state. The modern name of Russia, which came into use in the 17th century, is derived from the Greek rho omega sigma iota alpha, which in turn derives from sigma, an early Greek name for the people of Rus. Rus as a state had no proper name. By its inhabitants it was called Ruskaya Zemlya, with Rus of Skyu becoming Ruskaya in modern Russian, which translates as land of the Rus. The word Rusovskaya is an adjective. The morpheme ask corresponds etymologically to Englishish. Adja marks feminine adjectives. In similar fashion, Poland is called Polska by its inhabitants, that is, Polskie, originally being the adjective Polish, to distinguish the medieval Rus state from other states that derived from it. Modern historiography calls it Kievan Rus. Its predecessor, the 9th century Rus Khaganate, is a somewhat hypothetical state whose existence is inferred from a handful of early medieval Byzantine and Persian and Arabic sources that mention that the Rus were governed by a Khagan. Etymology. According to the most prominent theory, the name Rus, like the Finnish name for Sweden, is derived from an Old Norse term for the men who row, as rowing was the main method of navigating the rivers of Eastern Europe, and that it could be linked to the Swedish coastal area of Roslagen or Roden, as it was known in earlier times. The name Rus would then have the same origin as the Finnish, Estonian, Voro and Northern Sami names for Sweden, Ruotsi, Ruotsi, Rudzi and Ruata. It is remarkable enough that the local Finnic and Permic peoples in northern Russia proper use the same name both for Sweden and Russia. Thus the Veps name for Sweden and Swedish is Rosinma, Rosin, while in the neighboring Komi language the etymologically corresponding term Rockmus, rock, means already Russia and Russian instead. The Danish scholar Torkarsten has pointed out that the territory of present-day Upperland, Södermanland and East Gothland in ancient times was known as Rotha or Rothan. Thomson accordingly has suggested that Rotha probably derived from Rodsman or Rodskala, meaning seafarers or rowers. Ivar Aasen, the Norwegian philologist and lexicographer, noted Norwegian dialect variants Rossfolk, Roska, Rossman. Early evidence. In Old East Slavic literature, the East Slavs referred to themselves as Ruski, or, really, Rusici. The East Slavs are thought to have adopted this name from the Varangian elite, which was first mentioned in the 830s in the Annales Bertiniani. The Annales recount that Louis the Pious's court at Ingelheim am Rhine in 839 was visited by a delegation from the Byzantine emperor. The delegates included two men who called themselves Rose. Louis inquired about their origins and learned that they were Swedes. Fearing that they were spies for the brothers the Danes, he jailed them. They were also mentioned in the 860s by Byzantine Patriarch Photios under the name Rose. Russia was used by Ahmad ibn Fadlan for Varangians near Astrakhan, and by the Persian traveler Ahmad ibn Rusta who visited Veliki Novgorod and described how the Rus exploited the Slavicisms for the Rus. They live on an island that takes 3 days to walk round and is covered with thick undergrowth and forests. It is most unhealthy. They harried the Slavs, using ships to reach them. They carried them off as slaves and sell them. They have no fields but simply live on what they get from the Slavs' lands. When a son is born, the father will go up to the newborn baby, sword in hand, throwing it down. He says, "I shall not leave you with any property. You have only what you can provide with this weapon." Quote, when the Varangians arrived in Constantinople, the Byzantines considered and described the Rose as a different people from the Slavosis in his treatise De Administrando Imperio. Constantine VII describes the Rose as the neighbors of Pechenegs, who buy from the latter cows, horses, and sheep, because none of these animals may be found in Rosia. His description represents the Rus as a warlike northern tribe. Constantine also enumerates the names of the Dnieper cataracts in both Rus and in Slavic languages. The Rus names have distinct Germanic etymology: Esupi, Alv or sea, Gelantry, Ra4, Varuforus, Lenti, Stroken. According to the primary chronicle, a historical compilation attributed to the 12th century, Rus was a group of Varangians who lived on the other side of the Baltic Sea in Scandinavia. The Varangians were first expelled, then invited to rule the warring Slavs and Baltic Finns of Veliki Novgorod. The four tribes who had been forced to pay tribute to the Varangians, Chuds, Slavs, Merians and Kriviks, drove the Varangians back beyond the sea, refused to pay them further tribute, and set out to govern themselves. But there was no law among them, and tribe rose against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war one against the other. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us, and judge us according to custom." Thus they went overseas to the Varangians, to the Rus. These particular Varangians were known as Rus, just as some are called Swedes, and others Normans and Angles, and still others Gotlanders, for they were thus named. The Chuds, the Slavs, the Kriviks and the Ves then said to the Rus, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come reign as princes, rule over us." 3 brothers, with the kinfolk, were selected. They brought with them all the Rus and migrated. The earliest written mention of the word Rus or Russian appears in the primary chronicle under the year 912. When describing a peace treaty, signed by the Varangian Oleg of Novgorod during his campaign on Constantinople, it contains the following passage: Oleg sent his men to make peace and sign a treaty between the Greeks and the Rus, saying thus, "We of the Rus, Karl, Inigeld, Farlif, Veramud, Rulev Gudi, ruled Khan, Fralav, Rua, Actavus, Truin, Ligel, Vost, Stemmed, sent by Oleg, the great prince of Rus, and all those under him." It can be noted that none of the Rus names listed are Slavic and few are likely to be Finnic, most or all are Germanic. Later, the primary chronicle tells us, they conquered Kiev and created Kievan Rus. The territory they conquered was named after them, as were, eventually, the local people. However, the Synod scroll of the Novgorod First Chronicle, which is partly based on the original list of the late 11th century and partly on the primary chronicle, does not name the Varangians asked by the Chuds, Slavs and Kriviks to reign their obstreperous lands as the Rus. One can assume that there was no original mention of the Varangians as the Rus due to the old list predating the primary chronicle and the Synod. Scroll only referred to the primary chronicle if the pages of the old list were blemished. Other spellings used in Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries were as follows: Rusi, Rusi, Rusia and Razari. But perhaps the most popular term to refer to the Rus was Rugi, a name of the ancient East Germanic tribe related to the Goths. Olga of Kiev, for instance, was called in the Frankish annals Regina Rugorum, that is, the Queen of the Rugi. In the 11th century, the dominant term in the Latin tradition was Russia. It was used, among others, by Themar of Mersburg, Adam of Bremen, Cosmas of Prague, and Pope Gregory VII in his letter to Iziaslav I. Russia, Razia, Razja were alternative spellings. During the 12th century, Russia gradually made way for two other Latin terms, Russia and Ruthenia. Russia was the dominant Romance language form, first used by Liutprand of Cremona in the 960s and then by Peter Damian in the 1030s. It became ubiquitous in English and French documents in the 12th century. Ruthenia, first documented in the early 12th century Augsburg Annals, was a Latin form preferred by the Apostolic Chancery of the Latin Church. From Rus to Russia. In modern English historiography, Kievan Rus is the most common name for the ancient East Slavic state, followed by Kievan Rus, Kievan Russia, ancient Russian state, and, extremely rarely, Kievan Ruthenia. It is also called the princedom or principality of Kiev, or just Kiev. The vast political state was subsequently divided into several parts. The most influential were, in the south, Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia, and in the north, Vladimir Suzdal and the Novgorod Republic. The southern part fell under Polish and Lithuanian influence. The northern part, under much weaker Mongol influence, went on to become a loose federation of principalities. Patriarch Callistus I of Constantinople in 1361 created two metropolitan sees, the one called Great Rus in Vladimir and Kiev and the other one called Little Rus, with the centers in Gallic and Novgorod. There are claims, from Russian authors, that the names are not of Slavic origin. By the 15th century, the rulers of the Grand Duchy of Moscow had reunited the northern parts of the former Kievan Rus. Ivan III of Russia was the first local ruler to be proclaimed Grand Prince of all Rus. This title was used by the Grand Dukes of Vladimir since early 14th century, and the first prince to use it was Mikhail of Tver. Ivan III was styled by Maximilian I Holy Roman Emperor as Rex Albus and Rex Russia. Later, Rus, in the Russian language specifically, evolved into the Byzantine-influenced form, Russia in Greek. Different from other Slavic languages, in the specific case of the Russian language, Ruski refers to both the Rus people and modern-day Russians, Russiyski, with no distinction. In modern Polish, the words being Ruski, which may equally refer to modern Belarusians, Ukrainians, or both, or in a historical context to the people of Kievan Rus, contrasted to Rosijski. Similarly, in other Slavic languages, including modern Ukrainian, Ruskyy refers to Rus, whereas Rosijski refers to Russia. From Rus to Ukraine. Meanwhile, the southwestern territories of historical Rus had been incorporated into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, as a whole, was dominated by Rus, as it was populated mainly by Rus. Many of its nobles were of Rus origin, and a descendant of Ruthenian and East Slavic language is the language of most surviving official documents prior to 1697. The southern territories dominated by Lithuania have cognate names in Russian and Polish, respectively, Belarus and Rus-Biala, White Russia and a modern nation of Belarus. Chorna Rus and Russana, Black Ruthenia, part of modern Belarus. Chervona Rus and Ruscha-One, Red Ruthenia, now a small strip in Poland and the rest in Ukraine. Poland called this area the Ruthenian Voivodeship. Zelena Rus, Siberia. New Rus, Novorossiya. While Russian descendants of the Rus called themselves Ruskia, the residents of these lands called themselves Russenia Ruskia. The word Ukraine is first recorded in the 15th century Hypatian Codex of the 12th and 13th century Primary Chronicle, whose 1187 entry on the death of Prince Volodymyr of Pereyaslav says the Ukraine are grown for him. The term is also mentioned for the years 1189, 1213, 1280, and 1282 for various East Slavic lands, possibly referring to different principalities of Kievan Rus or to different borderlands. In 1654, under the Pereyaslav Agreement, the Cossack lands of the Zaporozhian host were signed into the protectorate of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, including the Cossack Hetmanate of Left Bank Ukraine and Zaporozhia. In Russia, these lands were referred to as Little Russia. Colonies established in lands ceded from the Ottoman Empire along the Black Sea were called Novorossiya, New Russia. In the final decades of the 18th century, the Russian Empire, Prussia and Austria dismembered the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in a series of partitions, and all of historic Rus, save for Galicia, became part of the Russian Empire. During a period of cultural revival after 1840, the members of a secret ideological society in Kiev, the Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius, revived the use of the name Ukraine for the homeland of the Little Russian people. They drew upon a name which had been used by 17th-century Ukrainian Cossacks. It had earlier appeared on 16th-century maps of Kiev and its local area. Ukraine was originally an Old East Slavic word for a bordered land, or a separated land parcel, a separate part of a tribe's territory, attested as far back as the 12th century. See Krajina for cognates. In the early 20th century, the name Ukraine became more widely accepted, and was used as the official name for the short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic, West Ukrainian People's Republic and Ukrainian State, and for the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Application of the name Ruthenia became narrowed to Carpathian Ruthenia, south of the Carpathian Mountains in the Kingdom of Hungary, where many local Slavs consider themselves Russians. Carpathian Ruthenia incorporated the cities of Mukachev, Uzhhorod and Prešov. Carpathian Rus had been part of the Kingdom of Hungary since 907, and had been known as Magna Rus, but was also called Karpato Rus, or Zakarpattia. Alternate anti-Normanist theories. A number of alternative etymologies have been suggested. These are derived from the anti-Normanist school of thought in Russian historiography during the 19th century and in the Soviet era. These hypotheses are considered unlikely in Western mainstream academia. Slavic and Iranian etymologies suggested by anti-Normanist scholars include the Roxolani, a Sarmatian people who inhabited southern Ukraine, Moldova and Romania, one of two rivers in Ukraine, the Ros and Rusna, near Kiev and Pereyaslav, respectively, whose names are derived from a postulated Slavic term for water, akin to Rosa, Rusolka, Ruslo. Russi, light brown, said of hair color, a postulated Proto-Slavic word for bear, cognate with Arctos nursis. The name Rus may have originated from the Iranian name of the Volga River as well as from the Rosh of Ezekiel. Professor George Vernadsky has suggested a derivation from the Roxolania from the Aryan term Ronsa. River names such as Ros are common in Eastern Europe. The Russian linguist I.N. Danilevsky, in his Ancient Rus as seen by contemporaries and descendants, argued against these theories, stating that the anti-Normanists neglected the realities of the ancient Slavic languages and that the nation name Rus could not have arisen from any of the proposed origins. The populace of the Ros River would have been known as Roshane. Red-haired or bare-origined people would have ended the self-name with the plural ain or ichi, and not with the singular s. Most theories are based on a Ros root, and in ancient Slavic an o would never have become the u in Rus. Danilevsky further argued that the term followed the general pattern of Slavic names for neighboring Uralic peoples, the Chud, Vesk, Perm, Sum, etc., but that the only possible word that it could be based on, Ruotsi, presented a historical dead end, since no such tribal and national name was known from non-Slavic sources. Ruotsi bullshit. However, the Finnish name for Sweden, Danilevsky, shows that the oldest historical source, the primary chronicle, is inconsistent in what it refers to as the Rus. In adjacent passages, the Rus are grouped with Varangians, with the Slavs, and also set apart from the Slavs and Varangians. Danilevsky suggests that the Rus were originally not a nation but a social class, which can explain the irregularities in the primary chronicle and the lack of early non-Slavic sources.